It was a cold, quiet night at Jefferson Memorial Hospital. The kind of stillness that was almost eerie. The usually bustling halls had quieted down, and the only sounds were the steady beeps and hums of machines monitoring the patients. The night shift staff, though tired and worn from their long hours, moved through the halls with practiced ease, checking on patients and making sure everything was in order. But as Nurse Emily Parker walked through the NICU, she felt a strange, inexplicable sense of unease, a feeling that something out of the ordinary was about to happen. Emily had worked at the hospital for years, enough to know when something wasn't right. She was used to the heavy responsibility of caring for fragile babies, each one hanging on to life by a thread. But tonight, something felt different. She stood at the doorway of room 3, looking in at a tiny baby, barely over a pound, struggling against the machines that kept her alive. Her heart rate had been erratic for the past few days, and no matter what they did, it didn't stabilize. The medical team had been at their wits' end, unable to make any progress. As Emily entered the room, her stomach twisted with anxiety. The baby's heart rate monitor gave off a faint beep, then a longer, more disturbing flatline. Emily's hands flew to the machine, her breath catching as she checked the readings. Nothing. She could feel the tension in the air, thick with the weight of inevitable loss. She called for help, but deep down, Emily knew there was nothing more they could do. The baby was fading, slipping further away with each passing second. But then, something strange happened. The sound of clicking nails echoed down the sterile hallway. Emily barely registered it at first, until she looked up and saw a large golden retriever standing in the doorway of the NICU. He was calm, his fur gleaming under the hospital's harsh fluorescent lights. He walked with purpose, his brown eyes scanning the room as though he knew exactly where he needed to go. His presence in the hospital was a surprise. This wasn't a therapy dog, and it certainly wasn't part of the hospital's standard procedures. But something about the dog felt right. As if on instinct, Emily stepped aside, watching the dog with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. He didn't seem lost or confused. In fact, his movements were deliberate, focused. He walked past Emily and straight to the crib, stopping beside it and staring down at the baby with what could only be described as a knowing gaze. The baby, whose heart rate had been dangerously low moments before, showed a slight improvement. Emily blinked in confusion, her gaze shifting between the baby and the dog. Could it be? Was this just a coincidence? The baby's vitals, so weak just moments ago, were now beginning to stabilize. The irregular beeping slowed, replaced by a soft, steady rhythm. Emily's heart raced as she watched, unsure of what to make of it. The dog, Charlie, as Emily would later learn, sat calmly by the crib, watching the baby with an almost protective gaze. His presence seemed to bring a sense of calm to the room, as if he was there for a reason that Emily couldn't quite understand. She stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to piece together what was happening. Was it possible that this dog was somehow playing a role in the baby's recovery? The other nurses had yet to notice the dog, too busy with their rounds. Emily found herself unsure whether to call attention to him or simply let him stay. Something told her that, for now, it was best to let things unfold. She watched as Charlie's quiet presence continued to soothe the baby, his breathing becoming steadier, more regular. Emily could hardly believe her own eyes. It wasn't just that the baby was stabilizing, it was the way the entire room felt different. The atmosphere, once thick with anxiety and hopelessness, was now filled with a subtle peace, as if the air itself had lightened. The machines, which had been emitting alarming beeps only moments ago, now beeped gently in the background, almost in sync with the baby's new, steady heartbeat. Emily was still standing at the foot of the crib when one of the other nurses, Linda, came in. She glanced around, looking at the baby's heart rate monitor and then at Emily. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Emily shook her head, her eyes never leaving the baby and the dog. "I don't know, but something's happening here." Linda followed Emily's gaze and saw Charlie sitting beside the crib. She frowned, as though unsure what to make of the situation. "That dog? He's not supposed to be here. Is he a therapy dog?" "No," Emily replied, her voice soft. "I've never seen him before." Linda stood silently for a moment, watching the dog. There was something calming about him, something almost reassuring. She couldn't deny the change in the baby's condition, but the rational part of her mind told her that this wasn't possible. Dogs didn't heal people. They couldn't reverse the course of a child's life-threatening illness. But as Emily continued to watch Charlie and the baby, a thought began to form in her mind. Perhaps, just for tonight, it didn't matter what was possible or impossible. The baby had shown no signs of improvement for days. And now, suddenly, there was a small but undeniable change. Emily felt a spark of hope in her chest. Could this dog truly be making a difference? Charlie remained still by the crib, never leaving the baby's side. His eyes occasionally flickered toward Emily, as though acknowledging her presence. But his focus never wavered from the child. And as the hours passed, the baby's condition continued to improve. For the first time in days, Emily felt a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks: hope. She couldn't explain it, but for now, that didn't matter. Something extraordinary was happening in this room. Something that went beyond the boundaries of medicine. Something that didn't need to be explained to be believed. As the night shift continued and the baby's condition improved, Emily stood beside the crib, watching Charlie with a growing sense of awe and wonder. Whatever had brought this dog to the NICU, Emily felt that he was meant to be here tonight, right now, when the baby needed him most. She didn't know what the future held, but for tonight, Emily allowed herself to believe in something more than science. She believed in miracles. The days that followed were nothing short of extraordinary. Charlie, the golden retriever who had inexplicably appeared in the NICU, became an unlikely fixture in room 3, beside the crib of the fragile baby. Each night, as Emily took her shift, she found herself waiting for his arrival, eager to see how the baby would fare with his calming presence. And each night, without fail, Charlie would arrive, walking through the hospital's sterile halls as though he belonged there, as though he had been coming for years. The hospital staff had become accustomed to Charlie's nightly visits, although none of them could explain where he had come from or how he seemed to know exactly where to go. At first, there had been some murmurs of concern from the hospital administration, but Emily had quickly made it clear that Charlie was helping, and despite a few raised eyebrows, they allowed him to stay. After all, the baby's condition was improving in ways that could not be ignored. By the third night, the baby's heart rate had stabilized. Her breathing was no longer labored, and the alarming fluctuations had given way to a steady rhythm. Emily couldn't explain it. The medical staff had adjusted the dosage of medication, tried different interventions, but nothing had worked like Charlie's silent presence by the crib. Charlie's calm demeanor had a ripple effect on the entire NICU. Emily noticed that the once constant tension in the air had lightened. Nurses and doctors alike seemed more at ease. Even the babies in other rooms seemed to sleep more soundly, their monitors showing steadier readings than before. On the fourth night, Emily stayed longer than usual. She had brought her book to read, though she found herself unable to focus on it. Her eyes kept drifting back to Charlie, who lay quietly beside the crib, his head resting on his paws, his soft eyes never leaving the baby. His presence was so natural, so unassuming, that Emily wondered if the dog even knew the full impact he was having on the child's recovery. As she watched, she found herself reflecting on her own life. Emily had always believed in the power of small acts of kindness, the simple gestures that could change the course of someone's day. She'd lost her younger brother when she was in high school, and ever since, she'd clung to the hope that there was something beyond the realm of human understanding, a force that could intervene in the most dire of situations. Perhaps this dog was one of those inexplicable forces, sent in a way that no one could quite explain. She had heard stories of dogs saving lives, of their ability to sense illness, but never had she seen it firsthand in such a tangible way. Her mind drifted to her own experiences in the hospital. She had worked with countless babies, many of whom had not made it. She'd learned how to keep her emotions in check, to distance herself from the pain of losing a patient. But with this baby, she couldn't help but feel deeply. She had become attached to the tiny life, had watched the little one fight for survival with every breath. Now, with Charlie's silent intervention, the baby seemed to be winning the battle. "He's here again," Linda, one of the other nurses, remarked quietly as she walked into the room, noticing Charlie beside the crib. Emily nodded without looking up. "Yeah, every night. And look at her, she's improving. It's not just the meds. Linda, it's him. He's the reason." Linda glanced at the dog with a skeptical look. "I don't know, Emily. It's hard to believe that a dog can change anything. But, I have to admit, the baby does look better." The two nurses stood in silence for a moment, both watching the baby as her tiny chest rose and fell in a steady, rhythmic pattern. The change was undeniable. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft. "I've been doing this for a long time. I've never seen anything like it. Something about him. It's like he knows what to do. Like he's supposed to be here." Linda gave a slow nod, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe you're right. I've been noticing the same thing. The baby's not the only one who seems to be doing better either. Other babies in the NICU seem more stable when he's around. It's weird, but I'm starting to think, maybe there's more to this than we realize." As the days passed, Charlie continued to show up at the NICU. Without fail, he never wandered the halls aimlessly, never barked or drew attention to himself. He simply arrived, settled by the crib, and watched over the baby. His presence was almost sacred, and Emily couldn't help but feel that Charlie was somehow tethered to the little one in a way that no one could explain. Even Dr. Carter, the head physician, began to notice the baby's improvement. Though he remained skeptical, he couldn't deny that the child was doing better than expected. The numbers on the heart monitor no longer fluctuated wildly, and the baby was no longer requiring as much intervention. But Dr. Carter was a man of logic, and he was reluctant to credit a dog with any part of the recovery. "Coincidence," he would mutter to himself when he saw Charlie by the crib. But Emily knew, she could feel it in her bones. Charlie was more than just a dog. He was a lifeline. The miracle that had begun to unfold in room 3 hadn't gone unnoticed for long. While the NICU staff was divided, some believing in the strange bond between Charlie and the baby, others were growing concerned. Most of them kept their opinions to themselves, unwilling to challenge the status quo. But there was one man who couldn't ignore what he saw: Dr. William Carter. Dr. Carter was a seasoned, no-nonsense physician, renowned for his meticulous attention to detail and his firm belief in science. He had been the head of the NICU for over 15 years. And in all his years of practice, He had never encountered anything like this. Dogs didn't heal babies. There was no scientific explanation for it. It was a simple matter of medical fact. Or so he believed. But as the days passed and Charlie's presence continued to coincide with the baby's improvement, Dr. Carter began to feel uneasy. The baby, once hanging on by a thread, with heart rate fluctuations and shallow breathing, was now stabilizing in ways that couldn't be chalked up to mere coincidence. The machines that had been beeping erratically for days now showed steady, normal readings. The baby was still fragile. But there was hope where before there had been none. That hope, however, was not something Dr. Carter was willing to entertain. On the 5th day, Dr. Carter arrived at the NICU during Emily's shift. He had heard the whispers, rumors that a dog was helping a patient recover, but he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. He was a man of evidence, not superstition. The idea that an animal could somehow influence the course of a medical condition was absurd. Still, something made him pause as he walked into room 3. Emily, standing near the crib, glanced up at him nervously. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice hesitant. "What brings you here?" "I'm here to check on the baby," he said curtly, his gaze flicking to Charlie, who was curled up next to the crib. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he forgot to mask his skepticism. "And I see our mysterious guest is still here." Emily stiffened. "Charlie's been helping the baby, she's improving. I know it's hard to believe, but I don't need you to tell me what you think is happening here." Dr. Carter interrupted, his voice sharp. "You're a nurse, Emily. You know better than anyone that this is not how medicine works." Emily bit her lip, fighting the urge to argue. She had seen the charts. She had watched the baby's vitals stabilize in a way that didn't make sense. But the frustration she felt was nothing compared to the sinking feeling she now had in her stomach. She had always respected Dr. Carter's judgment, but something about his dismissiveness, his refusal to consider the possibility of a miracle, made her heart ache. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Dr. Carter, I know it's not what you're used to, but just look at her." She gestured toward the baby, whose chest rose and fell in a regular, calm rhythm. "She's alive because of this dog." Dr. Carter shook his head, as if trying to shake the absurdity from his thoughts. "There's no medical evidence to support any of this. This dog is just a distraction. We need to focus on the real treatments, not give in to whatever this is." Emily's eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and determination. She wasn't going to let him take Charlie away, not when she knew that this dog was part of the reason the baby was still alive. The thought of losing him, and the baby's chance at survival, was unbearable. She stepped forward, positioning herself between Dr. Carter and the crib. "Charlie stays," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "If you want to remove him, you'll have to remove me, too, because I won't let you take away the one thing that's made a difference." Dr. Carter's eyes narrowed. "You're overstepping, Emily. You're jeopardizing the care of this child." But Emily stood her ground. "I'm not. You can see for yourself. The baby's condition is improving. I'm not saying it's the dog alone, but he's part of it. And if you remove him, I'm afraid that her condition will deteriorate again." For a moment, the two stood facing each other, locked in an unspoken battle of wills. Emily could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. She could see the frustration in Dr. Carter's eyes as he crossed his arms, his mind clearly racing. But what could he say? The numbers were there. How could he explain the sudden stability in the baby's condition? After a long, tense silence, Dr. Carter finally spoke. his voice a low growl. "I'm going to report this to the administration. We can't keep letting you bend the rules. Emily, if you continue to insist on this unorthodox behavior, there will be consequences." Emily swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She knew what that meant. The hospital would intervene, and there was a very real possibility that they would take Charlie away, perhaps permanently. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the baby was so close to surviving. Not when Charlie had become such a crucial part of the equation. As Dr. Carter stormed out of the room, Emily felt a pang of fear gnaw at her insides. She was in danger of losing everything: the baby's chance at survival, Charlie's place in the NICU, her own job, and yet, in the pit of her stomach, she also felt a renewed sense of purpose. She couldn't just give up. She wouldn't. Later that night, when the shift had quieted and the ICU was mostly empty, Emily sat beside the crib, keeping her vigil. Charlie, as usual, was by the baby's side, his head resting on the floor, eyes half closed but always aware. Emily watched him closely, her fingers lightly brushing the baby's tiny hand as she whispered a prayer of thanks. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know why Charlie had come, or how he seemed to know exactly what to do. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let him go. Not now, not when he had already proven that he was part of the baby's fight for survival. Suddenly, the room was plunged into a deep silence, and Emily froze. The heart monitor, which had been steady for days, began to beep erratically. Her stomach dropped as she looked at the screen. Its readings were wildly fluctuating, climbing and falling with alarming speed. Emily stood up quickly, her pulse racing. The baby's heart rate was spiking again. She turned to Charlie, who had lifted his head in response to the sudden change. The dog's eyes locked with hers, calm yet full of urgency. Emily didn't hesitate. She rushed to the baby's side, hoping and praying that this wasn't the beginning of another downward spiral. The night air outside Jefferson Memorial Hospital was chilly, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocating with tension. The baby's heart monitor beeped wildly, its rapid fluctuations echoing through the sterile room. Emily stood frozen beside the crib, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the numbers climb and drop in erratic patterns. It was a scene that had played out countless times before, and each time, it led to fear and helplessness. She glanced at Charlie, who had immediately sat up, his alert eyes locked onto the baby. His presence, usually a calming force, now seemed to heighten the intensity of the situation. Emily had always believed that Charlie was the key to the baby's survival. But as she watched the heart monitor's chaotic readings, a wave of doubt began to creep into her mind. What if this time, Charlie's presence wasn't enough? What if she had been wrong? Charlie rose from his resting position and padded softly over to the crib, nudging the baby's tiny hand gently with his nose. The quiet, almost reverent touch of his nose against the baby's skin seemed to bring a brief moment of calm. The heart monitor's beeping slowed for a heartbeat, then returned to its erratic pace. Emily's pulse quickened. She had to do something. If Charlie could help in any way, she had to keep him by the baby's side. But just as she was about to call out for assistance, the door to the room opened with a soft click. She turned to see Dr. Carter standing in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. "Emily, what's going on here?" Dr. Carter's voice was terse, laced with frustration and disbelief. He had been observing the situation for days, and now, standing in front of the baby's crib, he could see the vital signs flickering wildly on the monitor. Emily's heart sank. This was it, the moment she had feared. She knew Dr. Carter wouldn't accept what was happening here. He had always been a man of reason, a scientist who demanded proof. And there was no way to explain the connection between the dog and the baby's recovery. I don't know, Emily stammered, trying to remain calm. Her vitals are all over the place again. But Charlie, he's been here every night. He's been helping. And now, I see the dog. Dr. Carter interrupted, his tone cold. But I don't see any evidence that he's making a difference. This isn't a time for sentimentality. Emily, we need to focus on the facts. We need to stabilize the patient. Emily took a step forward, blocking his path to the crib. I can't just watch you take him away. Dr. Carter, you don't understand, when he's here, she improves. The numbers stabilize. But when he's gone, they crash. Please, you have to believe me. Dr. Carter's gaze flicked to Charlie, who stood by the crib, watching the baby with a calm yet intense focus. He looked at the dog for a long moment, his brow furrowing in disbelief. It's just coincidence. There's no way that dog can heal this child. The human body doesn't work that way. Emily, you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. Emily's heart clenched. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could Dr. Carter, someone she respected so much, be so dismissive of something she knew in her heart was real? She couldn't just stand by and let him take Charlie away. Not after everything they had been through together. Not after seeing the change that had come over the baby. I don't care about your protocols right now, Emily said, her voice trembling with emotion but firm with resolve. This baby's life is at stake. And so is Charlie's place here. I've seen it, every time he's near her. Her condition improves. We can't just ignore that. Dr. Carter shook his head, his jaw tightening. I understand that you're emotionally attached. But we can't base medical decisions on this. There's no data, no evidence. We are a hospital, Emily, not a shelter for strays. Emily felt the heat rise in her chest. You're wrong. You can't measure this with data. Dr. Carter, this isn't just medicine. It's something beyond that. Something miraculous. Dr. Carter looked at her with a mixture of frustration and pity. He seemed to debate for a moment, glancing back at Charlie one more time before finally crossing his arms. I'm going to report this. You can't keep this up. I'll make sure you're held accountable for any further disruptions in the NICU. I'm removing this dog. The weight of his words hit Emily like a brick. She couldn't believe this was happening. Not when she had seen the incredible progress the baby had made. Not when Charlie was the only thing that had made a difference. She glanced over at the baby, whose heart rate was still fluctuating. The thought of losing Charlie, of watching the baby's health deteriorate again, was unbearable. For a moment, Emily was paralyzed by fear and helplessness. But then, something shifted inside her. She couldn't let go of her belief. Not now, not after everything she had seen. No, Emily said, her voice shaking but resolute. I won't let you take him away. If you do, it's not just a dog you'll be removing. You'll be taking away the only hope this baby has. And I won't stand by and watch that happen. Dr. Carter's face reddened, and he took a step forward. You're overstepping, Emily. You're out of line, and you'll answer for it. But Emily didn't back down. She placed her hands protectively over the crib, standing between Dr. Carter and the baby. I'll take full responsibility, she said. If anything goes wrong, I'll be the one to answer for it. But I know in my heart that this dog is the reason she's still here. I won't let you take that away. Dr. Carter's eyes flashed with anger. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in him as well. Emily could see the conflict playing out in his mind, his dedication to science and his skepticism battling against the inexplicable evidence before him. He sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose as if trying to push away the headache forming. He wasn't used to this kind of uncertainty, this tug of war between his logic and the undeniable change in the baby's condition. "Fine," he muttered, though his voice was laced with frustration. "One more night. But after that, he's gone. Understand?" Emily nodded quickly, relief flooding her chest. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for tonight, they had one. Charlie would stay. And maybe, just maybe, the miracle would continue. As Dr. Carter walked out of the room, Emily turned back to the crib, her hand gently resting on the baby's tiny arm. She looked down at Charlie, who was now lying back down beside the baby. His eyes flickered up at her. And in that moment, Emily knew that this wasn't just about medicine. It was about something much bigger. She sat down beside the crib and whispered, "Thank you." Charlie's tail wagged softly, as though he understood. In the stillness of the night, with only the soft beep of the monitors and the quiet companionship of a dog by her side, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of hope. The next morning came with a fragile sense of calm, a quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. Emily hadn't slept much. The hours had dragged by in an agonizing blur as she sat by the crib, her gaze shifting between the baby and Charlie. Despite the steady beeping of the heart monitor, she could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing on her shoulders. Dr. Carter's ultimatum hung in the air, and though he had agreed to let Charlie stay for one more night, Emily knew that would not be enough. If things didn't turn around, the decision would be made. The dog would be removed from the hospital. Charlie, as always, remained a steady presence by the baby's side. His body lay curled up next to the crib, his head resting on his paws. But his eyes were watchful, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. The baby, whose once erratic heart rate had now stabilized, still appeared fragile, but the improvements were undeniable. Her breathing was deeper, more regular, and her color had begun to return to a healthier shade. The same progress that had initially sparked Emily's belief in Charlie's power was still evident. And the steady rhythm of the heart monitor reassured her, even if it didn't ease her anxiety. Emily leaned against the wall, running her hand through her hair as she stared at the baby's vitals. It was early in the shift, and the hospital was still quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. What if, when Dr. Carter returned to check on the baby, he decided that this miracle wasn't enough? What if, despite the baby's improvement, he still believed that Charlie was an unnecessary distraction? As if on cue, the door to the NICU opened, and Dr. Carter entered, his footsteps purposeful but slow. Emily's heart raced. She turned to him, her gaze meeting his with a mixture of fear and determination. "Dr. Carter," Emily said softly. Her voice was steady, though her stomach churned with uncertainty. "I know you're here to check on the baby, but I need to ask you for more time. Please." Dr. Carter didn't respond immediately. He walked over to the crib, his eyes scanning the monitors. He seemed to be deep in thought, his expression unreadable. Emily held her breath, waiting for him to speak, dreading the words that might follow. "Her condition is better," Dr. Carter finally said, his voice a mix of skepticism and reluctant acknowledgement. "It's improved over the past few days. But I still don't understand how." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "I know it's hard to explain, but Charlie has been here with her every night. And every night, she gets better. He's the reason she's still alive." Dr. Carter didn't meet her gaze. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the baby, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have an answer. There's no scientific explanation for what you're saying. He muttered, almost to himself. I can't just let this go. If we're going to keep this hospital running, we can't allow emotion to replace logic. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. She stepped closer to him, her voice steady but pleading. Please, Dr. Carter, you've seen it for yourself. Her heart rate, look. It's been steady for days. You can't deny that. She's improving, and Charlie is here, watching over her. If we take him away now, I'm afraid she won't make it. You've seen how it goes when he leaves. Dr. Carter didn't respond immediately, his gaze flicking back to the dog who lay beside the crib. Charlie's head had lifted, and for a moment, the dog's calm eyes met Dr. Carter's. It was as if Charlie was trying to communicate something beyond words. Beyond medicine. The silence stretched between them. Dr. Carter's expression softened for a moment, though he quickly masked it with a deep sigh. I don't know, Emily. I don't know what's happening here. But I can't ignore the fact that she's stable. And maybe, just maybe, there's something to this. But we can't keep operating on belief alone. Emily's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the moment, the fragile hope that hung on the edge of Dr. Carter's next words. What are you saying? She asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Carter looked at her, his eyes filled with conflict. One more night, he said finally, his voice low and resigned. But that's it. If she stabilizes further and shows sustained improvement, we'll consider the possibility of letting this continue. But no promises. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Thank you, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She had done it. Charlie would stay. At least for now, the baby would have another chance. As Dr. Carter turned to leave the room, Emily glanced at Charlie, whose eyes remained fixed on the baby, unwavering in his vigilance. The dog had been her silent ally. And now, more than ever, she knew she couldn't let go. There was something inexplicable at work here, a force beyond the medical field, beyond explanation, and it was too powerful to dismiss. Hours passed slowly as Emily continued her shift. The baby's condition remained stable, her vitals steady and strong. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Would Charlie be enough to save her? Would the dog's presence be the key to breaking through the baby's struggle for survival? Or would the rational world that Dr. Carter represented pull everything back into a cold, scientific reality, just as the first light of dawn crept through the hospital windows? Something miraculous happened. The baby, whose condition had been critical for so long, opened her eyes. Emily's heart leapt in her chest. She rushed to the crib, her hands trembling as she reached out to gently touch the baby's tiny fingers. The baby's eyes fluttered open, and she blinked at the world around her, as if waking from a long, dark sleep. Dr. Carter, Emily cried out, her voice full of disbelief and wonder. Moments later, the entire medical team rushed in, their faces filled with confusion and awe as they observed the baby's sudden improvement. Dr. Carter stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of shock and wonder as he watched the baby, whose heart rate had now stabilized completely. The monitors that had once beeped so urgently now displayed steady, reassuring numbers. There's no explanation, Dr. Carter murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. I can't explain this. The baby's vitals are stronger than they've been in weeks. What changed? Emily looked down at Charlie, who had quietly risen from his place beside the crib. The dog's eyes met hers, calm and knowing. His work here, it seemed, was done. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she knelt down beside Charlie. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Charlie's tail wagged softly in response. And then, with a final, lingering glance at the baby, he turned and padded toward the door. As Charlie disappeared down the hallway, Emily stood there, watching him go, filled with a sense of gratitude she could hardly put into words. The miracle had happened, the baby was alive, and Charlie had been the catalyst. There was no explanation for it, no science that could account for the sudden turn of events, but in that moment, Emily didn't need one. Some things, she realized, were meant to be felt, not explained, and as she watched the baby peacefully resting, her tiny chest rising and falling with steady breath, Emily understood that miracles often came in the most unexpected forms, sometimes in the shape of a dog named Charlie.